Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to join this group. My name is Fiona Campbell. I'm Chief Executive of the Association of Scotland Self-Caterers and a proud resident of Arica in the wonderful National Park. Firstly, my apologies that I'm not able to be with you in person today. I'm currently en route to Gloucestershire to speak at a conference focused on the unintended consequences of poor policy design, which is in many ways highly relevant to the discussion we're having here. I appreciate that this is a complex and at times sensitive issue. I also recognise the responsibility that you hold, both as board members and officers, in trying to navigate what is a difficult balance. What I want to do today is to share an industry perspective that is grounded not only in evidence, but in what we are seeing in practice on the ground. Because ultimately, we're all trying to achieve the same outcome, which is sustainable, thriving communities. So, as a starting point, what exactly are we trying to solve? If I may, I'd like to begin with a simple framing question. Is it housing supply? Is it affordability? Is it empty homes or sustaining communities? Because those are related, but they're not the same problem. And that distinction matters. If we're not precise about the objective, it becomes very difficult to design effective policy. Looking at the data across Scotland, short-term lets, or as I like to call them, self-catering properties, account for just 0.8% of dwellings. Long-term empty homes account for around 3.6%, which is over 4 times higher than self-catering units. Within rural and national park contexts, around 5% of homes are second homes, with empty homes adding further pressure. What this tells us is that there is a structural housing challenge, not one driven by a single sector. The second point, which is particularly relevant for this group, is the evidence base within the park, or indeed the evidence gap. At present, there's no single data set for short-term lets. Data is fragmented across 4 local authorities, and there's no agreed baseline or monitoring framework. So we're being asked to consider intervention without a clear understanding of scale or impact. That's not a criticism, it's a practical constraint. Because without baseline data and defined success metrics, it becomes very difficult to answer, is this proportionate and will it deliver the intended outcome? I want to be very clear on one point. There are real concerns in communities about housing. People are worried about whether they can afford to live locally, whether homes are available, and what that means for the future of their communities. Those concerns are entirely valid. From an industry perspective, we are not dismissing them. We share the same goal of sustainable, functioning communities. But the evidence suggests that these pressures are being driven by supply constraints, empty homes, second homes, and wider system dynamics. So the key question becomes, are we targeting the right drivers? It's also important to recognise what self-catering represents in this context. This isn't dormant housing. It is a regulated, economically active sector. Across Scotland, it contributes almost £1 billion in GVA, supporting over 29,000 jobs. In areas like this, that activity is fundamental to local economies. But critically, demand for self-catering is not static. It is growing year on year. More people are choosing self-catering because it offers a more affordable way to travel, a more inclusive option for families, multi-generational groups, and those with specific needs, and a more sustainable model, often with low intensity of service and resource use. And it's important to recognise that this sector doesn't just serve tourists. It supports a wide range of real-world needs, including workers on temporary contracts, people displaced by fire or flood, individuals and families relocating, and those on secondment or working remotely for extended periods. So this is not a niche product. It's a flexible, responsible part of the wider housing and tourism ecosystem. There are a myriad of reasons why self-catering is an essential part of the accommodation mix, which leads to a very simple but important question. If we constrain or displace this sector, where does that demand go? Because it doesn't disappear. The businesses that we represent are operating within the system. They're licensed, They're regulated and they're compliant. They've already adapted to significant regulatory change. So when we look at further intervention, we're talking about existing lawful businesses. There's also a deeper issue here around certainty and fairness. The typical operator is not a large-scale investor. In fact, around 80% of our members are women over the age of 55 operating a single property. Often this forms part of their retirement income or household sustainability. These are individuals who are bedded in their communities. And yet what we're now seeing is a level of policy uncertainty that is profoundly destabilising for that demographic. Despite the outcome of the Muirhead judicial review, we're still seeing attempts, particularly within Highland Council, to apply planning control area requirements to pre-existing lawful and compliant businesses. That raises serious questions around consistency, clarity, and legal certainty. Because from a business perspective, you can be compliant one day and effectively non-viable the next if you get planning policy wrong. For small micro businesses, this is not theoretical, it's existential. It's quite simply the sword of Damocles hanging over already vulnerable enterprises. So what are we seeing in practice? From a practical perspective, we're already seeing the cumulative impact of current policy. Since October 2022, there have been numerous planning applications linked to short-term lets. Each one involves time, cost, and administrative burden. That affects business viability, planning system capacity, and overall efficiency. We're also seeing the compounding effect of layered policy intervention, particularly where planning is being used as an additional control mechanism. Planning is a powerful tool, but when applied to an already regulated sector without clear evidence of impact, it becomes fraught with risk. In particular, Policy 30E of NPF 4 is proving to be an effectively impossible test for many compliant operators to meet. That's causing real financial strain, prolonged uncertainty, and in some cases, forced exit from the sector. We now have a senior council opinion indicating that the current framework is legally vulnerable, particularly in relation to proportionality, consistency, and human rights protections. So there is a very real possibility that continued application of these policies, particularly where they affect existing lawful businesses, may result in further legal challenge. If we look at Edinburgh, where a planning control area has already been introduced, there is no measurable evidence of improved housing supply or affordability. There is no formal monitoring or evaluation framework based on a 2026 Freedom of Information request. At the same time, prices and rents have continued to rise. A similar lack of evidence exists in Ward 20 of Badenoch and Strathspey, where information requests still haven't been met, back since January. So this raises an important question. How do we ensure that any intervention here is evidence-led and measurable, and indeed measured? In a national park context, this becomes even more important. You have a statutory duty to support sustainable economic development and thriving communities. Tourism is central to that. So this is not simply a housing system, it's a tourism-dependent rural economy. The challenge is to balance those two things effectively. If that balance isn't right, the risks are absolutely clear. We could see loss of businesses, reduced visitor spend, and pressure on local services. At the same time, there is a real risk that housing outcomes do not materially improve. And I want to be clear, this is not an overstatement. This is the reality on the ground. We're not seeing a clear shift into affordable housing supply. Instead, in many areas, we're seeing increases in second homes, increases in empty homes, and a reduction in economically active regulated accommodation. So we must ask, is that the desired outcome? From our perspective, the focus should be on first, establishing a clear evidence base within the national park. Second, targeting the main drivers, empty homes, second homes, neither of which are economically active, and supply constraints. Third, ensuring that any interventions are proportionate, place-based and regularly reviewed. And importantly, working in partnership with industry. If I may leave you with one final thought, every policy intervention, particularly within planning, must be tested, not just for intent, but for real-world impact, displacement effects, legal robustness, and unintended consequences, because these systems are interconnected. Interventions shift behaviour. They create incentives, and sometimes they produce outcomes that are directly counter the original objective. So the question is not simply, can we intervene, but should we intervene based on evidence, proportionality, and likely outcomes? And critically, who bears the cost if we get that wrong? Because right now, that cost is falling on real people running real businesses within the national park itself that you are custodians of. And policy that is unclear, inconsistently applied, or retrospectively enforced does not just fail businesses, it undermines trust in the system itself. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I very much look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.